Good afternoon from Singapore to everyone who is tuning in from various locations, and welcome to a virtual roundtable hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. My name is Clemens Che, and I'm a research fellow at MEI, and equally your moderator for today's discussion. I'm joined by two esteemed colleagues from the Gulf, His Excellency Mr. Nasser Al-Sheikh and Dr. Omar Al-Ubaidli. A warm welcome to both of you. I will introduce their profiles shortly, but please allow me to say a few words about the issues that we seek to tackle and address today. The undying and indeed perennial question of economic diversification continues to draw attention to the Gulf states, especially in light of the high oil prices and geopolitically what we can term a cooling regional climate, especially in intra-Gulf ties. But we are also seeing competition, and whether healthy or not, that is something we'll be asking our speakers. Saudi Arabia, for instance, comes with an ambition to become the region's central destination for foreign investment and economic activity, pushing for firms to set up regional headquarters in the kingdom, and also announcing a target of foreign direct investment, FDI, of at least 100 billion annually by 2030. And on the other hand, we have the UAE's landmark project of the 50 initiative announced last year, marking the nation's 50th birthday, or National Day really, last year, which also aims to attract over $150 billion FDI in the next 10 years. More recently, in fact, the government of Dubai announced that the Emirate retained its top rank worldwide for attracting FDI into tourism. So there's a question of asking whether such competition is healthy, while the other Gulf states seek to distinguish themselves via various projects, whether in hydrogen or in renewables. Equally important is to look at domestic constituencies with the easing of COVID restrictions, the opening of borders, and the question of taxes. So there are a number of intertwined themes that we will tackle under the banner of economic diversification and competition. So please allow me now to introduce our two speakers. First off, please let me welcome His Excellency Mr. Nasser Al-Sheikh, a thought leader and a member of the UAE's development force over the last 2 decades. He currently chairs Emirate National Holdings and Al-Sheikh Investments, and he previously held top public positions such as the Director General at the Department of Finance under the Government of Dubai, as a member also of the Executive Council entrusted with steering Dubai's strategic plan, and as a member of the Supreme Fiscal Committee. He has also held various leadership roles on boards related to real estate, education, retail and corporate banking, among others. So welcome on board, Mr. Al-Sheikh. Our second speaker is Dr. Omar Al-Ubaidli, the Director of Research at Dirasat, Bahrain. He's also an affiliated Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University and holds affiliated fellowships with the Mercator Center, King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, and Trend Advisory Groups in the UAE. As an accomplished economist, Dr. Al-Ubaidli has produced and published many articles in both academic and media outlets. So warm welcome to you, Omar. Let me explain the sequence of our discussion. And that will be, we'll start with Dr. Al-Ubaidli first, followed by Mr. Al-Sheikh. They'll give their opening remarks in about 8 to 10 minutes each, after which we will have the Q&A session, and you are free, the audience, you are free to put in your questions in the Zoom chat box. So let us now begin our discussion by setting the stage with Dr. Omar Al-Ubaidli. In your opening remarks, Omar, could you give us a broad assessment of the current situation in the Gulf, not only with the high oil prices, but also the implementation of the VAT taxes? How have these worked out? How competitive are the Gulf economies, and how well have they done in terms of COVID resilience and the opening of borders? And going back to our event title for today, is the UAE leading the pack while the rest are playing catch up? Over to you, Omar.
Thank you very much, Clems, for the invitation, and for MEI for the invitation to contribute in today's event. So I'll be brief. First of all, regarding oil prices and their effect on economic policies, in the past, what we've seen when oil prices have been high, as in, for example, the period 2000 until 2014, or especially until 2011, what we've seen in the past is that the knee-jerk reaction of GCC countries is to use that in a consumptive way by raising public sector salaries, by going on public sector hiring binges, and even when they make investments, making sort of investments that don't fall into a strategic, a well articulated strategic vision. But on this occasion, we're seeing much more prudent use of the elevated revenues, and this is for two reasons. One is that there's a realization that this is likely to be a transient. We still don't know. I think it's safe to say that everybody here is somewhat surprised by how high oil prices are at the moment, and they could be high again in the future, who knows? But I think there's a realization that this is something that it might not happen again. And so it's not wise to create spending patterns that that depend upon the sustenance of such high prices. And also, more importantly, because after 2014, the political barriers to effecting economic transitions and attempts at diversification has been overcome to a significant degree. And so the entrenched interests, which have previously prevented sort of genuine diversification, have been overcome to a significant extent. And so now the funds get allocated in a much more sensible manner. In tandem with the rising oil prices, as Clemens mentioned, we've seen VAT implemented in Saudi Arabia and UAE in 2018, I believe, at the start, and then Bahrain 2019, and Oman at the beginning of 2022. Kuwait and Qatar at present do not have plans to implement VAT. Kuwait was potentially thinking about it, but I think with oil prices the way they are now, they've been able to shelve that. VAT has many virtues at a purely technical level. If you look down the menu of taxes, then for technical logistical reasons, it's quite attractive. I won't go through the details; they're somewhat tiresome, but there is a reason why it's one of the most popular taxes in the world, and for that reason, it has been one of the more popular. It has been, one of the early taxes adopted by the GCC, but also at the political level, it's much less sensitive than the concept of an income tax. We've seen corporation tax either adopted or scheduled to be adopted in the UAE and other countries in the region. And I think to some extent that reflects exploiting the global efforts at raising corporate taxes. I'm sure you also, I think around 6 months ago, Janet Yellen and other leading finance ministers across the world announcing a big deal to try to harmonize corporation taxes to try to prevent big corporations from evading taxes through legal and illegal means. And so the GCC countries have seized upon that impetus, being parties to that agreement, to introduce corporation tax without such a fear that this will lead to capital flight because other countries are having to play ball too. Oman, going back to the issue of common income tax, was scheduled to do income tax in the middle of 2022. Then it delayed, and I think now it's going to be bringing it back. And I'm sure all the GCC countries will be following that experiment closely because it is something that will probably eventually have to implement. VAT is not sufficient, and they will be looking to see what the political backlash is, if there is any, regarding the implementation of income tax. And in terms of attracting talent, the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular have been very aggressive in introducing reforms, attempt to attract talent from across the world. These most salient elements of that have been, first of all, introducing sort of more institutionalized forms of permanent residency and naturalization, and naturalization in particular in a much more open and advanced way than in the past. UAE in particular, but also Saudi Arabia, have been making life also more comfortable for global citizens. So that means things as simple as allowing films, Hollywood films, to be shown without love scenes being cut out, or something more complicated like allowing unwed couples to live together, to cohabit, and allowing more social freedoms that were previously not permitted. In addition, as Clemens mentioned, the issue of COVID, the UAE in particular has been leveraging its sound management of the COVID crisis as a way of attracting global talent. It was already a very nice place to live, but I think the gap between the UAE and competing countries, especially in the West, has widened significantly during the COVID because UAE has done well, and so many Western countries have made such a complete hash of dealing with COVID. And I'm talking about countries which normally attract migrants in huge quantities, most saliently the US. The US is still has a somewhat schizophrenic relationship with with COVID, and that makes life very uncertain and irritating for the rich. And the UAE says, you don't have to worry about that. Come and live with us. And I think it's bearing fruit. To round things off in terms of my overall assessment, I think most of these changes and reforms are generally well-founded and heading in the right direction. But I want to draw attention to a basic weakness that all these policies have, which is a lack of dialogue with what I would call the homegrown scientific community. There's just a total disconnect, or near total disconnect, between academics and scholars on the one hand, working and living in these countries, especially the ones who are citizens of these countries, and the policies that get made. And this is most easily seen if you contrast it with a policy done in the US. So when the policy is done in the US, prior to the policy being done, it's something which obviously also frequently been proposed in many scientific papers in the academic community, has been proposed in the think tanks, and discussed openly. And then immediately after its implementation, I should say during the implementation stage, there are extensive consultations with academics and scientists, sometimes in an ad hoc way and sometimes formally through committees and councils, such as the Council of Economic Advisors in the US. And then after the implementation, it unleashes a huge torrent of scientific literature analyzing the impact, which is then, feeds back into the policy framework in terms of refinements that are made by policymakers. Is discussed in congressional hearings, discussed in top ministries, at every level. These are not just sort of academics speaking to themselves. This is an essential part of the policy process of forging policy. In contrast, in the GCC, papers just don't get written at all. And even if they do get written, they're often written by foreigners, very frequently foreigners who are not even based in the region. And that's not the fault. I'm not criticizing those foreigners. If I'm an academic in Harvard University's Middle Eastern Studies department and I want to analyze a policy, power to me. It's the fact that the scholars, that my counterparts in the GCC are not writing papers on the issue, it's their fault. It's not my fault that I'm writing the papers. And there's several reasons for this. The proximate, cause is a fundamental lack of data. If you go to the website of any, ministry in the GCC, the data is anywhere between, weak to laughably absent. But that proximate cause is actually reflects two deeper causes. One is, I think, I can say, is there's a lack of belief among policymakers in the value of such research. I think that many policymakers, despite what they might say openly, just don't really believe that this kind of research is something that is useful for policymaking. Certainly, they don't buy in the same way that policymakers in Singapore or in US or UK might buy into the value of such research. And also, I think it's partially due to a fear of criticisms and self-censorship. Scholars are hasty, are anxious about the possibility of writing a policy. Let's say, that a VAT has been introduced in several GCC countries. I think that a scholar, a tax expert in the GCC, looking to analyze VAT retrospectively, would be much more fearful of doing that than a scholar doing the same in the UK or France or Germany, because they would be worried that if they wrote something that was critical, this might not be well looked upon, and this may have professional consequences. And so, as a consequence of all of these factors together, you have this continuing disconnect, and when you have this disconnect, sometimes you have good policies. But sometimes you have bad policies, and even when you do have good policies or bad policies, the rate at which they're rectified and repaired is much slower. And just to round off, Clemens, I know perhaps I've gone a little bit over, but just to give you an illustration of this, a very nice illustration in the UK. So UK's pandemics expert was a guy called Neil Ferguson. And during the pandemic, he was the one advising the UK government on, and he was leading their modeling. Their mathematical modeling of the pandemic. And because the UK has a very transparent process for the relatively speaking, for this policy. At some point, he had to publish his models and make them available online and his data. And people discovered he had coding errors in his model, and this was leading to mistakes in the policies. And then these policies were fixed. I should say, having coding errors, even if you're one of the top 10 people in the world in infectious diseases, is totally normal. Nobody, no matter how intelligent you are, people make coding errors. People are humans, and these mistakes happen. But the only reason this mistake was found is because of the commitment to transparency, the commitment to data openness, and there was no shame. People found a mistake. Okay, he got a rap on the knuckles. I'm sure he was embarrassed, but he's still considered a top expert, and the error was fixed. The same thing doesn't happen in the GCC because nobody ever sees the models, because the governments don't believe in the value of making such models openly available. They don't think that giving scholars access to such data is something which leads to a higher quality of research and policy making. And so if such a mistake were to be made in the GCC, and it probably was, in terms of by likelihood, there are humans in the GCC just like there are humans in the UK and the US, then the time it would take to fix the error would be considerably longer. And the same thing applies to all the things I've described, whether it's VAT, naturalization, any sort of economic policies. The rate at which we can advance and refine these policies is considerably slower because of this lack of dialogue between the research community and policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. I think you provided us with not only a broad assessment, but also many thought-provoking questions that we will tackle again, which will resurface during the Q&A, I'm sure. But we shall now proceed to Mr. Nasser Al-Sheikh for his remarks. And of course, Nasser, you are able to respond to Omar's earlier comments. And also, given your experience, what are the steps taken by the UAE to remain at the forefront of attracting business? And being heavily involved in Dubai's administration previously, how does Dubai itself distinguish from the rest of the Federation in terms of its role? We also like to hear your views on energy. And of course, this can be taken further during the Q&A. My question about energy, goes back to the MENA Climate Week in Dubai previously in March. And Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, the UAE Minister of Industry and Advanced Technology, stated, and I quote, "The key lesson is that we should not adopt climate policies that lead to energy poverty. We need to keep investing low cost, low carbon energy that can be provided, that can provide the baseload of power that the world relies on today." So we would like to hear your views on low cost, low carbon energy. And we've also just seen the latest news that Dubai has announced, the reduction of fuel prices. And what's your take on this and its association also, among other policies, with the new leadership under President Mohamed bin Zayed, who has also rolled out financial support packages and other social policies? So over to you, Nasser.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm privileged to be with you, with the distinguished moderator, distinguished speaker, and distinguished participants. And I thank them for taking the time to listen to us. Now, if we're talking about the UAE's positioning today and the future, I think it's very important to understand a bit of history just to put things into context. So in 1971, we have 7 emirates deciding that it's better to unite. So the result was, a country called the United Arab Emirates, and that was 50 years ago. It had a population of less than 300,000 people. It had only 277,000 people. It had a GDP of 6 billion dirhams, which is less than $2 billion. Okay. And it was way behind more established countries like Bahrain, Kuwait, and so on. So I think, you take it 30 years, fast forward 30 years up to 2001. In 2001, the GDP of the UAE crossed $100 billion. Okay, and that's that's the 30-year journey, and it had a population of around 3.3 million people. But then you take it again, fast forward 20 years, the GDP crossed $400 billion. And we had the population of approximately 10 million people. So it's, when I look at that timeline, in the first, I would say in the first 3 decades, the UAE was focused on building itself, was focused on building its infrastructure, building its government capacity, laying the foundation for its business community, as the economic sector and so on. So I mean, everything was being built from scratch. But I think from 2001, this is where we saw the UAE on steroids, where it grew by $300 billion in GDP, and the population grew by approximately 7 million people. And that's quite important, because I mean, when we look at what do we have as a UAE, what do we have in 2021? Because I mean, if we're saying UAE is leading the pack, currently in the GCC, we need to support that with facts. So if I look at sovereign wealth, for example, and I think Bloomberg just reported it a few days ago, where GCC sovereign wealth funds were valued at approximately, they had around $3 trillion. Around 50% of that was in the UAE. So today we have a country that has sovereign wealth funds, which has assets under management of over $1.5 trillion. Okay, so 90% of that goes to Abu Dhabi, 10% of that is the Dubai Sovereign Wealth Fund, ICD. So I mean, all of that is important to understand, because when we look at what you mentioned, the projects, let's say, what I don't remember the exact name, but the goals that were announced, towards last year, end of last year, and it drew a picture of where we see the UAE in about another 50 years. Okay, and there were a number of headlines, but what caught my attention was the goal of doubling the economy within 10 years. So again, if I try to simplify it, whatever was achieved in the past 50 years, the goal now is to achieve the same in about 10 years, grow the GDP by $400 billion. And that's very important to understand, the impact such a thing has on everything, be it in population, be it on government spending, on opportunities for the private sector, I mean, the UAE was leading, up to this year, the UAE has been the leading attractor of FDI in the region. So it's not only the GCC, the whole Middle East, but the ambitions are, greater and bigger. And without understanding the history, I mean, you can say, okay, these are just dreams, but there was something achieved in the past 50 years. I think one of the most important things that throughout the past 50 years, we also had, I think the country had a lot of learnings from regional successes like Bahrain at one point in time, like Kuwait, Beirut. But even if we take it into, just widen the circle a bit, again, there were very important learnings from Singapore, from Hong Kong, and so on. And we like such examples because they're similar to us in size, So again, I mean, all of these learnings, were taken in, absorbed, and we came with our own version of, let's say, economic development / prosperity. Okay. And I think there were a number of sectors that, if I told you maybe 23, 30 years ago, we'll have tourists coming to the GCC, you would have labeled me as a fool. However, just pre-COVID, the UAE managed to attract over 20 million visitors. 75% of those were in Dubai. And Dubai was the fourth, as per the MasterCard index, Dubai was the fourth most visited city on earth. Dubai's airport was and still is the #1 airport in the world when you look at international traffic. So, I mean, there are certain successes, but if there is one important learning from looking at the past, I think, it's evident that if you do not keep on going, you can lose your leadership position easily, And today, when I look at the region, the GCC, of course, I mean, we have big aspirations, coming up in Saudi, big aspirations, of course, I mean, in Qatar. And I think, it's only justified for us to see aspirations coming up in Oman, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, and so on. So, I see so much, let's say, negative coverage coming from that, And in all honesty, again, history is a very good teacher. So when we look at Europe, or even if we look at the Far East, what the ASEAN countries have managed to do, if there is one learning, is that, prosperity is contagious, And if you have a bloc prospering together, you individually can prosper more, okay? So, I mean, yes, competition will push each one to his limits, will get the best out of everyone, but I think it's good for the bloc, okay? I don't think the UAE can be everything to every country in the region. And even the same applies to Saudi, Bahrain, any country. But as we see these aspirations coming, and as we see them being executed, I think we will, just looking at Europe, looking at the Far East, we will see countries, excelling in certain areas, and so, I mean, competition, I see it as a positive thing. So, I mean, when I come back to the again the initiatives that were announced late last year, it's not only, of course, I mean, there was a big emphasis on the economy, but if I say we have managed to build the hardware over the past 50 years, I think the next 50 years is more focused on the software, okay? So we do have, world-class infrastructure when it comes, to hard infrastructure, the people, talent, the companies that we have managed to attract, and so on. But now it's more about software. So, I mean, when I look at, some of the goals, like announced in Dubai, to become, the most, livable city in the world. Of course, I mean, that's a big goal, but at least, there is an emphasis on living, let's say, standards. I remember in 2001, when we looked at Dubai and tried to identify what's missing in Dubai to attract, international talent. And there were a few sectors where we needed to focus on. Healthcare was a sector that we needed to improve. Education was a sector that we needed to improve. So introduction of, world-class healthcare provider, world-class education, providers. So I think, going forward, we will see more of these soft touches, and I don't think the UAE intends, I don't think the UAE intends to let go of its leadership position. It's doubling down. When I look at, Yeah, I mean, and that's about, you know, the, let's say, the economic standing of the UAE. When I look at, you know, the other social changes, if you like, of course, I mean, you mentioned, you know, the president, Sheikh Mohamed bin Zayed, and he's not new to the role, you know. Unfortunately, the late Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed you know, was sick for a number of years, so Sheikh Mohamed bin Zayed was assuming that role already. Okay, and there is no learning, you know, for him. You know, it's just a matter of, you know, just like if I compare it with a company, you know, you have an acting CEO and you just took out the acting and this is the CEO, you know. So I mean, he's not new to the role. There was this emphasis on the local population, you know. Of course, I mean, yeah, I've been talking about the positives, but we have negatives too. So we live in a country where, you know, only 10% of the population is you know, local population. However, we do have an issue with unemployment, for example. You know, it's still single digits, lower single digits, but when you're providing, you know, millions of let's say job opportunities for, you know, many nationalities, you know, I think it's an issue when you have, you know, local unemployment, and there were, you know, big plans there. There were big plans there from the government to subsidize the even, you know, to subsidize the salaries of the local workforce in the private sector. So making the private sector play, you know, play its role in addressing this issue. Of course, I mean, there were huge changes in companies law. For example, foreign ownership was opened 100%. You know, there were changes in many social laws. You know. Unmarried people, you know, living together, because that was a practice, and whether we want to acknowledge it or not, that is a practice in all GCC countries. But the only thing that we did, we put it on paper as a law, you know, so that is not unlawful. So I think, you know, going forward, we'll still see more changes, because one of the great advantages of the UAE is it's not big in size. Okay, decision making is quite quick. So if there are flaws in anything, any, you know, piece of legislation, it can be revised quickly. You know, Dr. Umar mentioned, you know, the involvement of the, let's say, the scientific, let's say, the scientific, as doctors or research centers or so on, in policy making and so on. But if I see it from another angle, that makes decision making, you know, pretty fast. Of course, there is that risk of getting things wrong, but it can be rectified quickly, you know, and that was evident in the way that we dealt with COVID. You know, I think the GCC, and I won't single the UAE out, but I think the GCC dealt with COVID well, you know, because we did not, you know, these are absolute monarchies. Decisions are made, they are followed. Okay, and if it doesn't work, another, you know, it can be revised. So I mean, we were flexible enough for decisions, you know, to be revised in light of a new finding, new data, whatever. So I mean, I think going forward, we will see more improvement. And I think maybe I took more than my time, so I'll just leave it there maybe, and we'll address more things in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Nasser. And I think Nasser, he addressed the question of transparency that Umar brought up earlier, which I wanted to ask again, but now he has responded to it. And so we'll just leave it as that for now. We do have questions coming in from the floor, but I have questions of my own, which I will kickstart the discussion and then incorporate our questions from our friends in the audience. So to Omar, really, I think you've written a lot of op-ed pieces about the public sector. And of course, you know, there's been many writings about a saturated public sector and how attractive it is, and sort of, you know, an iron rice bowl, as we call it here. So are there efforts being done to change that kind of perception? And if so, what are they? That's my question to Omar. And to Nasser, you talked a bit about continuity in terms of the UAE leadership from His Highness the President Mohamed bin Zayed at the minute. And I wanted to ask about the coordination with, for example, the rest of the Emirates in the Federation. For example, the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohamed bin Rashid, you know, what has been the trend of coordination? And you talked about decision making as well. So I wanted to ask you about this coordination that enables these economic policies to be rolled out quickly and decisively. Maybe let's start with Omar first. Thank you.
So just to give some context, the public sectors of the Gulf countries are relatively young, certainly compared to European countries, and so one key difference is that since their inception, the public sectors of the Gulf countries have not been purely conceived of as tools of public administration. Public sector jobs have, since their inception in the GCC, been used as a way of increasing the living standards and creating jobs for citizens. So as a consequence, you've had some highly bloated and overstaffed public sectors for 50 years. Because they serve this dual purpose of creating jobs and giving people income to feed their families and so on and so forth. And what this results in is really low productivity levels in the GCC public sectors. I mean, the UAE is somewhere that's relatively good compared to the other GCC countries. Bahrain's probably somewhere in between. Kuwait would probably be something more towards the less productive part of the spectrum, but none of them has a public sector where I think the amount they spend can be, the productivity can be considered at the level they aspire to. And there could be all sorts of red tape and poor decision making and errors as a consequence of these sort of bloated structures. Now, what's happened in COVID, and also since oil prices decreased in 2014, is there's been an impetus to rationalize. For the first time, there's been a strong desire to try to restructure these public sectors in a manner that can lead to more effective decision making, and they can eliminate some of the barriers that have historically existed. And you're also seeing that happen quite aggressively in Saudi Arabia now under Vision 2030. And one of the big advantages of COVID in particular, when you're dealing with an overstaffed, and bloated public sector, is that so usually in public sectors it's very hard to measure productivity. That's true whether you're in Singapore, Russia, Brazil, USA, whatever. And so it can be very hard to promote people who are good and to get rid of people who are bad at their job. But in COVID, in a crisis like COVID, it can be very clear. It makes very clear who's doing their job properly, who's up to the task, who's not up to the task. And so this gives the people at the top who make the decisions the data they need to clean house and get rid of some of the people who've been, blocking the public sector for decades. Some of these legacy hires that you don't normally have an excuse to get rid of, but now you have an excuse to get rid of them. And in Bahrain, we recently, about a month ago, we had a cabinet reshuffle, and it's the biggest cabinet reshuffle in the history of Bahrain. And there were many, many new and young faces, and many of those were people who performed well during COVID. The UAE has a very young cabinet by local and international standards. And again, many of those people are people who've demonstrated their competence, their aptitude during the last 5 years, which have been periods of great stress for the UAE and other countries. So in that sense, people will talk about crisis producing opportunities. One of the opportunities that a crisis affords public sector decision makers is that it helps you diagnose who's a weak administrator and who's a competent administrator. And so that's one of the great positives. And I think the UAE is very aggressive now in terms of, I mean, UAE has always had a culture, a better culture of accountability in its public sector than the other Gulf countries. But even if you have a high culture of accountability, at the end of the day, if you're not in a crisis, it's still difficult to distinguish between the good and the bad. But in a crisis, it's very clear. So I'd say that's one of the big benefits we've seen.
Thanks, Oman. Over to you, Nasser, to my question earlier.
I apologize, I forgot the question.
Yes, my question was on the coordination of the UAE leadership between the different rulers of the Emirates in the Federation, and in particular, I singled out, for example, the ruler of Dubai with the president, for example, in rolling out the economic policies swiftly and decisively.
Sure.
I think you're muted again.
Okay, what Dr. Umar has been saying is so interesting that it made me, forget the question. But thank you for reminding me. I think, when it comes, again, I mean, when it comes to the coordination, there is, and I will link that to the competition too, which was mentioned. I think because we're a federation and with the way that the country is structured, I think this is one of the main reasons is that we do not mind competition and we excel at it, because we have Emirates competing against each other. Okay, so you will have you will have very similar projects, and sometimes when people question why. Being worked on in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, and sometimes in Sharjah, and elsewhere. So I mean, we're okay with that, and the thinking has always been that the more successful, for example, Dubai is, the better it is for the country. The more successful Abu Dhabi is, the better it is for the country, and so on. And of course, I mean, I'm revealing no secret if I say that the two Emirates which have most input on the federal agenda will be Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Of course, the Prime Minister, this is the executive branch of the federal government. The Prime Minister is the ruler of Dubai, and he, other than being entrusted with that because of the system, how the system works, he demonstrated what he did with Dubai when he was a crown prince too. So when again I go back to the timeline, 1971, 2001, and then 2021, and by the time Sheikh Mohamed bin Zayed came into power. This is where you saw that our economy just growing at astounding speed. So he has that in place. But when I look at overall policy, of course, I mean, again, sometimes we will have that kind of tug of war, if you like, between various Emirates, and we recently saw it with the way that COVID was being handled. Where it started with a unified, policy, or I won't call it policy, but unified strategy, how to deal with COVID. But as we went along, there was that deviation, and you had that Abu Dhabi school of thought, and you had, the Dubai school of thought, where Abu Dhabi was more reserved and Dubai was more, trying to strike that balance between protecting the people and protecting the economy too at the same time. So I mean, we do have that room of each emirate doing things in its own way. But I mean, these will be the two emirates that contribute most to policy making and so on.
Thank you, Nasser. So we are going to start with the list of questions I have now in my chat box, and it's a growing list, if I may add. So the first question is about fintech from my colleague Alessandro Adrino, who is a principal research fellow here at MEI. The question about fintech is about the fact that it's a spear tip of economic transition in the post-oil scenario. Yet there is a labor shortage and top fintech talent is hard to come by. So in terms of talent attraction policies, the main issue is talent retention. So how are the Gulf states and the UAE in particular planning to maintain a stable talent pool? So at this question, I think we will open it up to both speakers. Omar first, I guess. Over to you, Omar.
Sure. So I think we mentioned both, and Nasser and I mentioned some of the policies, some of the general talent attraction policies, such as the permanent residency naturalization and the living conditions allowing cohabitation of non-migrants and so on. But I would say, in addition to that, in terms of fintech, I think you have to take a geopolitical angle too. The UAE is somewhere that is positioning itself geopolitically as being an independent actor. It is not just on standby when the US calls and demands something that it will do it, or the UK or whatever. It has an excellent relationship with China. It has an excellent relationship with India. It has an excellent relationship with the US and all the Europe, with France. And I think it has a good relationship with Russia too. And I think that's important for people working in fintech because whether you're talking about cryptocurrencies or any sort of advanced financial technologies, I think one of the significant fears you have now in the wake of the Ukraine conflict is that at some point you'll be, your assets will be seized and you'll be frozen out of the international financial system. And here the UAE has, I think, quite intelligently sent a very strong and clear signal to the world's financial community that the UAE is not beholden to any economic or political bloc, and that it will maintain as wide a range of options to it and its residents and its citizens as is possible. And I think this is going to be potentially decisive in attracting and retaining top talent, not just the people involved in working, but also people, the owners of the capital themselves. If I'm a top Chinese investor, and if I'm a top Russian investor, if I'm a top Indian investor, then whereas in the past I may have thought that London or New York was a safer place for my assets as possible, I think now I strongly consider Abu Dhabi and Dubai as alternatives, and maybe even I've already taken my decision to move my assets there. And add to that, also important is that the macroeconomic policies of the UAE in terms of maintaining macro stability. The currency has been stable for decades. I think they learned a lot, the UAE, from the crisis that happened in 2008, in 2009 in Dubai, and have taken many measures in the financial sector to the stress tests and so on to shield the economy from macroeconomic instability, and that's demonstrated in the figures. And again, that's additional sources of attraction for talent. Whereas previously if I work in London or New York, if I want to be a top financial sector employee, but I always have to be worried about the ups and downs of those sectors, I can now make a good case for wanting to move to Dubai because Dubai is that little bit more stable economically than these countries.
Thanks, Omar. Over to you, Nasser.
I think when it comes to fintech, this is one of the announcements made in Dubai, and I would not limit it to fintech, but digital economy overall. With everything that comes with it, whether it's crypto, blockchain, metaverse, so digital economy overall. It is one of the goals of Dubai to be one of the leaders in that sector, and for the sector to contribute. I think I don't remember the exact figure, but to be a contributor to the Dubai economy. and to create, thousands of jobs. And we understand with that overall, we understand that, these things, I mean, there is no question that they are here to stay, and they will be there, whether it's, the cryptocurrencies or but it's being formed, and we understand that. And so we know that it's here to stay, but we do not know in what shape or form. So we have that flexibility also to devise, the required laws, revise them. Because I mean, when I look at, for example, when the government of Dubai looked at crypto exchanges, it did not seek advice from legal firms throughout the world and so on. It came to the likes of Binance and others, because they understand, how they want to see the legislation, and what problems they're facing in other places, and how, what will an ideal jurisdiction look like. Of course, I mean, they'll put all of their wish list, and then, it's up to the, legislator here, to cherry pick, what to include in the legislation. But I mean, there is that flexibility, and I agree with Dr. Amar that, I think the COVID era has been good to technology overall, because if we did not have these fintech tools, health tech tools, and so on, the countries would not have been able to operate. Yet, even when we had curfews, people were still being able, to transact, do many things electronically. So I agree, COVID was good to fintech.
Thank you, Nasser. And I think we'll come back to you again, this time to reverse the sequence. I'm going to condense two questions from the audience into one. Well, they're quite similar in that sense. And this one is for Nasser. It's about the non-oil sector in the UAE. And we've talked a bit about the factors that Gulf states have adopted to attract more talent. But what are the sectors that the UAE is focusing going forward for businesses and innovation in the country? And also, are there nations that the UAE finds useful in comparing as case studies to enhance its own public service, for example? And I'm combining these questions from Aisha and Misha from the floor. So this one is for Nasser.
I think I mean, as sectors, it will be, a changing thing, because now we're talking about digital economy and so on, which was not there, a few years ago. So that's a big, and that's a very big area, because it will have big impact on every single sector. The success of the fintech industry is forcing, for example, the banking sector to revisit its principles, and I think the more advances we have in technology, I think we will have many sectors being reinvented, if you like. So I think it's difficult. I mean, but if I say, one sector of the future for us that we see as important is the digital economy with all that it contains. Okay, but if I look at sectors, of course, I mean, energy is quite important for the UAE. It's one of the larger producers, but it's investing big time also in renewables, be it solar or wind farms all over the world, or even in producing hydrogen in the future. And I think both UAE and Saudi, and we touched upon that, in a previous discussion, are betting, are placing big bets on that. And we will see competition not only from the GCC. I mean, if you follow the news, I mean, a few days ago, again, India was investing big time in Egypt, for the production of hydrogen. So I think as sectors, I would say, those that come to mind right now. As countries, I won't say countries, but we always, even in my public sector days, we never look at countries. We look at experiences. Okay. If I look at, for example, digital government, if I want to improve government and so on, most probably I will be looking at Estonia, which many do not hear about, but I think, we seek successes that we can, we learn from, and I think, the government still does that. It has an open mind. Wherever there's a success, it will try to, study it, see how it can be not only implemented but be improved and done here.
Thank you, Nasser. That's great. Omar, the next question is for you. And I know Nasser earlier mentioned that, the competition is healthy, but you haven't given your 2 cents here. And the question also comes from the floor, and this more specifically on the economic diversification between Saudi Arabia and the UAE in terms of their transformation. Of course, the kingdom is doing its Vision 2030. And of course, the UAE is also pushing forward. So the question is it fair to compare the evolving model in the kingdom with that of the UAE? Over to you.
So first of all, I just want to second, what Nasser mentioned about competition being a good thing. I mean, this is a non-issue everywhere in the world. If you just take a simple example of the EU, when the UK was part of it, London was a financial capital, Paris was a financial capital, Frankfurt was a financial capital, and these things enriched each other, and this competition benefited. France wants the German economy to be prosperous. Germany wants the French economy to be prosperous. These are good things. They create markets for each other. Most of this narrative is just driven by, to be frank, if I'm going to be blunt, by people who are outside the region, who have a stake in making it look like there's some massive conflict about to erupt in the region, and they just, they make something out of nothing. There's competition. I mean, as I mentioned, there's competition between the Emirates within the UAE. There's competition between regions in provinces in Saudi Arabia. There's competition between provinces in China, between states in the US, New York and San Francisco and Silicon Valley and so on. This is totally normal, and this is generally, almost without exception, a good thing. So let's not fall into that, that trap of imagining that there's some massive conflict about to erupt just because two countries. In general, you want to be next to a big, prosperous economy, whether the UAE, Saudi Arabia, or anyone else. Regarding the nature of the transitions, I think there are, overall, that they have in common that both countries are trying to limit their dependence on oil and hydrocarbons in various ways. They also have identified key sectors, building on your last question, in common, such as hydrogen, various forms of renewable energy, obviously tourism. But there are some key differences between the approaches taken by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The first is that Saudi Arabia has an advantage in one sector which nobody will ever be able to challenge, which is religious tourism, because it has Mecca and Medina, and nobody's taking Mecca and Medina. Those two will remain the two most holy sites for Muslims. And obviously COVID is disrupting Hajj and Umrah, but 3 or 4 years from now, you'll be seeing a lot more people doing Hajj and Umrah, and that's something which is unique and will always, whereas the UAE promotes itself as quite a secular society, Saudi Arabia will always want to maintain some degree of a more Muslim identity in its global image, because it has those two holy sites under its administration. Second, the Saudi Arabian economy and the country and the population are significantly bigger than the UAE, and as a consequence, their strategy can be much more about their internal market. UAE have signed an FTA with Indian economy. And they're looking to sign an FTA under the GCC umbrella with the UK. And they're looking, I think, to do something similar with China. They probably will get that at some point soon. So the UAE's economic strategy, although it has a big market, I mean, Nasser mentioned, the tremendous growth in the UAE economy, it's still by global standards not the level that it wants to be at, and therefore to attract the highest level of innovators and investors, you need to have access to big markets. Getting access to the Indian market is obviously a huge thing, and getting access to EU, UK, and so on will be additional. And that's something which the Saudi Arabia doesn't have to pay as much attention to because it's such a big market in of itself. And then the final difference between the two is also, in terms of where they are in the process. The UAE has been, doing this. I can think we can say probably since the 80s has been, it's been a much more steady, although maybe of late they've accelerated, put their foot down a little bit harder. The economic transition that UAE is undergoing is one that's been undergoing in a long way, and that will continue to happen, somewhat more incrementally over the coming 50 years. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, they're like on steroids. If I'm sure Nasser, like me, has visited Saudi Arabia in the last 5 years and seen Riyadh, in 2001 is just unrecognizable. In fact, Riyadh 2011 is unrecognizable from Riyadh 2021. So the speed and why is that important? Well, first of all, it means that Saudi Arabia can benefit a lot more, first of all, from just copying what other countries do, including the UAE. But more importantly, the process of institutionalizing the changes is much more difficult for Saudi Arabia because it has to do it so quickly. It wants to do things so quickly, and so it can be very disruptive and dislocating, and that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it just means that it needs a lot more effort and coordination. The UAE can afford to do things in a much more cautious and methodical manner because it's been doing so for 20, 30 years now.
Thank you, Omar. Excellent. Thank you. The next question is for Nasser, and this really, revolves around the visas and residency permits that we talked about earlier. And the question is from Georgie, my colleague who's a visiting professor. Is there a nationality-based quota system in the UAE? That's part one. And part two is, are effects of climate change factored into the development plans of the UAE, especially about the smart city concept?
Okay, when it comes to, are there quotas? I believe there are unannounced quotas, and that was the practice in the past. In all honesty, I'm not really sure right now. But in the past, there was a periodic revision of how many, and I won't name countries, but it's mostly relevant to a few countries where there's a big population of that country here in the UAE. So these it was not like a hard policy, but there were attempts to encourage a more diversified mix, of nationalities. Of course, and I'm talking about something that was done in the past. There is no a number that if it reaches that number, there will be a hard no, no more new visas. That still goes on, but there's always effort to have more diversity within the country. When it comes to climate change, I think again it's one of those journeys that you announce. You say, okay, there is a goal, I want to get there, but you do not know really how we will get there. And this is, I think this depends on new innovations we see, coming in the future. So, I think again the UAE had announced a target of being, net zero carbon and so on. But again, all of these targets, I think globally, we're seeing that, okay, these can be announced, but will we really achieve it? That will greatly depend on the science that will enable us, to achieve that. In the past, and this is why when we talk about energy, this is one of the key issues of why we're having a big problem today. no investment was going in hydrocarbons, and all of a sudden there is not enough production, for the world. So I mean, countries are realizing that, so again, I think that's a goal that is important to have as a national agenda, but to keep in mind that it is to be revised as we go along.
Thanks, Nasser. The next question is for Omar, and it's on reforms to the criminal justice system and penal code. So can some measured reforms to the justice system and penal code be made to enhance the secular equality and impartiality rule of law that gives companies and individuals confidence to lead lives or conduct business? So that's for Omar.
So I'm not a legal expert. I'm an economist, but I'll talk the greatest, I'll talk about the things I can talk about to the greatest extent of my knowledge. So I would say that, first of all, the UAE has had a very successful experiment with its sort of commercial law in the last 20 years in terms of creating rapid arbitration courts that just make what I consider to be impartial decisions. If you look at any sort of index of economic freedom, or then the section on the quality of judicial decisions, commercial disputes in the UAE always comes out high, especially debate. And they went about this again in a very methodical way, attracting sort of top judges from the UK and establishing a system in the right way. But in terms of the broader legal system, I think there's definitely ways in which the existing system could be improved, but I don't think that will be a priority at present, for the simple reason that in the rest of the world we're seeing a disastrous direction in when it comes to things like rule of law, when it comes to things like the quality of criminal legal systems. And so there isn't such a pressure on the UAE to improve itself on this front. I think at the moment, when you see the way events are unfolding quite negatively in countries such as the UK, such as Hungary, such as the US, I think what people yearn for at an individual level is just the sort of stability which a country like the UAE can afford them. This is whether they're coming from an emerging economy or an advanced one. And so I think the UAE's reforms will tend to focus much more on other dimensions of life in the UAE, and rather than on sort of criminal legal reforms. But as I say, this is me, an economist, speaking rather than a legal scholar.
Thanks, Omar. The next question is by Asif Shuja, Senior Research Fellow here with MEI. And this question is for Nasser. Towards making the financial activities of Sharia compliant, while at the same time retaining their profitability, what cooperation, if any, is there between the UAE and Southeast Asian Muslim countries, especially Malaysia? That's for you.
Well, Dubai, again, I mean, Dubai had its aspirations when it comes to, Islamic finance overall. And there were, a number also of global successes, like, of course, Malaysia was mentioned, but I mean, you cannot rule out London. And I remember, maybe 15 years ago, I was asking which bank was the best in, Islamic banking, when it comes to governments, corporate, and so on. It was Deutsche Bank, at that time. So I think, as an opportunity, it's a great opportunity, but I think the decision here is to exploit that, to its potential. It's an evolving industry, but also not to lose on the conventional banking sector too, because I mean, these two, let's say, these two sectors are there, so I think even when it came to legislation, Dr. Umar mentioned, the arbitration and laws. And at that time, the IFC courts took that into consideration. What level of cooperation? Of course, experiences are being shared. We're always, I know from my time in public sector, and I know that even my colleagues later on, there is no reservation on sharing any experience. And whenever you see it, we saw experiences in other places, even in Malaysia. We went there and we tried to learn from what they did well, and to see if we can do the same and even better. Cooperation is open, but it's not systemized. If that is the question, it's not systemized. There's not like one channel you go that way. I think again it comes between time to time, so it's not something scheduled.
Thank you, Nasser. And I think our final question, really, which will wrap up our discussion for today. And I think this question is addressed to both speakers. Pretty relevant in terms of the global inflation, and also in terms of we saw the ship departing from the port of Odessa loaded with grains, and this question relates to food security, and we had our share of problem here in Singapore regarding chickens, the export of chickens from Malaysia. But the question really to both our speakers is on what are the steps taken to improve food security in the Gulf. And perhaps Omar, you can tackle it from a more Gulf perspective, and Nasser, you go into the UAE strategy on that. So Omar, all yours.
So at the start of the COVID crisis, a GCC committee level committee was established. There was an initiative by Kuwait to create a GCC strategy for dealing with food security, and it's something which all the GCC countries have been paying attention to actually prior to COVID. And what you're seeing, since that committee, that initiative started, significant efforts by each of the 6 countries to improve their food security. Now, they have different circumstances. For example, Saudi Arabia and Oman have much more capacity to domestically produce food than somewhere like Bahrain has. Bahrain is probably in the weakest position because we have such high population density in such land. And that's why Bahrain has been working actually on food security for quite a long time. We have relationships with Sudan, with Thailand, in order to secure food, and we've continued to develop those relationships. I know the UAE has actually a Minister of Food Security, reflecting the importance of the portfolio in the UAE. Again, UAE has more land than Bahrain. It's still basically a desert, so its options in terms of domestic food production, at least according to current technologies, are very limited, and obviously it has a very high population too. So overall, I would say each of the 6 countries have given the issue a very high priority. They've also, the situation has been chronically important because we are deserts and because we have such low capacity to produce. Nasser mentioned the massive rates of population growth in UAE and all the GCC really in the last 50 years. And so that has always created an acute awareness among GCC policymakers on issues relating to food security, even before the Ukraine conflict or COVID or the prevailing disruptions to supply lines. So I think the issue has always been important, has received even more importance, and the steps have been in terms of improving, first of all, generating high levels of domestic capacity to produce food, and at the same time improving strategic relations with other countries which have a surplus of food, whether it's ones in East Africa, whether ones in South Asia, or further afield. And I think that's also an important part of the, when you look at it on the geopolitical front, even setting aside direct food concerns, the efforts by the GCC countries to keep their strategic and options open geopolitically, partially it reflects food security issues. They don't want to be on the wrong side of Russia. They don't want to be on the wrong side of China, and wanting to maintain their food security is an important part of that.
Thanks, Omar. Over to you, Nasser.
Well, when it comes to food security, I think in the UAE context, it was on the national agenda for, I'd say, 15 years. Okay, and so much investment went into into companies around the globe when it comes to our food security. And even there was, I won't say an attempt, because I mean it's already a few national champions were created, to tackle that as corporates and so on. And I think the results surfaced when we had the lockdowns, where boundaries being closed between countries. And we found out, that being also a logistics hub for the region, that most of the food is being stored here, and distributed from here to the region. So that I think that was a testament of the good job that was done there. But I think with COVID, there was some emphasis that certain things, even if it's more expensive, they have to be grown locally, because what if borders close? I think we have a much better chance if we look at GCC strategy. If I influence policy making, this is one of the areas that I think the GCC can work on it better than each country trying to do its own thing. I mean, a country like, for example, a country like Qatar, of course, we're not going into the political side, but a country like Qatar learned, the hard way how to depend on itself, sourcing things from everywhere. So again, if I look at the GCC, I think a GCC-wide strategy would be better for everyone. I'm confident that if Bahrain wants to do it, UAE wants to do it, and others want to, I mean, we will be successful. But if we have a GCC strategy to tackle that, we'll even do much better than what each of us individually can achieve.
Thanks, Nasser. And the bottom line is really a lot of geopolitical coordination within the Gulf as well. So thank you. This has been a lively and very insightful discussion. So I would like to sincerely thank both our speakers, His Excellency Nasser Al-Sheikh and Dr. Omar Al-Ubaidli. Thank you for lending us your time and providing all your insights and brains. And also thank you to our audience for keeping the questions rolling in. And the discussion has been wonderful. So I thank all of you, and I hope to see all of you again on another of our events. So thank you, Omar. Thank you, Nasser.